Hey everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we are going to be going through the discography of the amazing band Utopia. A while back I had done a tier list of Todd Rundgren's studio albums, and Utopia was always in the back of my mind of a group that I wanted to cover and do another tier list of, but I needed to spend a little more time on their albums to really solidify my thoughts on them. But now the time has come and I'm ready to go, so I'm very excited to be covering them for today's episode. And what I'm going to do is go through their 9 studio albums, and I will also be including their unreleased 1976 album Disco Jets. And I'll go from Todd Rundgren's Utopia all the way up to POV, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest. And I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear where you agree and disagree with my takes and how you would rank these 10 albums. So please let me know. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Alright, we will start out with their debut studio album from 1974 titled Todd Rundgren's Utopia, and this is probably not going to surprise anybody, but I'm going to give this one an S. I absolutely love this album. Not only is it my favorite Utopia album, but it would also make my list of top 5 favorite prog rock albums as well. Musically, there is so much depth to each of these songs, and from a compositional standpoint, I think this music contrasts and complements Todd Rundgren's early 70s music so nicely. This initial formation of Utopia would have a different lineup than all of the studio albums that would follow it, and it wouldn't feature any of the people that are considered the classic members of Utopia, with the exception of Todd Rundgren, obviously. This is a 6-piece group with 3 keyboardists, guitar, bass, and drums, and most of the musicians on here had played on Todd Rundgren's previous 2 solo albums, A Wizard, a True Star, and Todd. The album consists of 4 songs, with only one of them being under 10 minutes in length, and the entire second side consisting of one 30-minute track. And to me, the 3 longer songs on here are all completely engaging and compositionally very adventurous and interesting, never knowing where the song is going to go next, but each of them also contrast one another very nicely. It opens up with Utopia theme, which is the only live song from this album, and I think it's a perfect opener. It brings things in so nicely. I love the way the opening section builds and eventually leads into that up-tempo groove, and things get going really nicely. I also love halfway through where everything drops out except for that keyboard sequence, and then the vocals enter. Such a satisfying moment, and I think throughout all of these songs, the way that they mix the instrumental sections with the vocal sections is done in a very effective way, and they are placed in sections that do a great job of keeping the momentum of these longer songs going. And I love how they bring back the riff from the very beginning of the song at the end, but they do it with that guitar doing that single note rhythmic pattern underneath it, which was another section of the song. A very cool combination of 2 parts, which has a really interesting effect to it, and a very solid way to wrap up this amazing opening track. After that, we have Freak Parade, which is a great follow-up song with an amazing energy to it. So many tasty and exotic riffs and instrumental figures between the guitars and the keys. Interesting use of different meters. Lots of fourth intervals. And the more technical and faster section serves as like a foundation to the song. And then the other sections with different feels and tempos will weave in between it. And just like I said with track 1, it's a very pleasant and unexpected surprise when the vocals enter on this one. Just another banger of a song that really keeps you on the edge of your seat and is a perfect follow-up track to the opener. Then we have Freedom Fighters, which was written by Todd Rundgren, and this is the one shorter song at 4 minutes in length. And I think this one is the perfect contrast to the opening 2 longer tracks, and a great song to set up the final 30-minute track on side 2. It still has those prog elements, but I would say that this is the song that probably sounds the most similar to later 70s Utopia, when they would undergo a stylistic shift and go into more of a pop direction, particularly in the chorus of this song. To me, it sounds like something that could have come right off of Oops, Wrong Planet or Adventures in Utopia. A very tasteful and catchy song with some great grooves and amazing chord changes and vocal melodies, and this one would be my second favorite song on this album, and it would also make my top 10 favorite Utopia song list. Then after that, we have my favorite song from the album, the closing track titled The Icon, which is their big 30-minute prog blowout. Absolutely incredible song with so much depth and adventure to it. going in and out of so many feels with the more technical and choppy opening part. Then we have some more groovy sections, some down-tempo parts, and some spacier and more atmospheric parts. I think the placement of the vocals, once again, is very effective throughout this song. It really keeps the song going nicely and provides nice contrasts and changes of pace from the instrumental parts. And my personal favorite vocal section is the part that comes in after the 17-minute mark. Some of my favorite vocal melodies of this entire album, and I think that entire section is the high point of the song and gives us a really nice pick-me-up for the last 13 minutes of the song, which leads into the final instrumental sections of the song, which veer in and out of a few different tempos and styles in a very surprising way. So an amazing and adventurous song that wraps up this album beautifully, and just an incredible debut album for Utopia to put out. The songwriting is top-notch. It really showcases the technical abilities of each member of this group, and it makes for an incredibly engaging and enjoyable listen where you're just constantly wondering what's going to happen next. And like I said at the beginning, going in this sort of musical direction just contrasts Todd Rundgren's early 70s work so nicely and complements it really well. So this is my favorite Utopia album and one of my favorite prog rock albums as well. So this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have an unreleased album from 1976 titled Disco Jets. This was recorded shortly after Todd Rundgren's Faithful album, and it was intended to be more of a comical album that parodies a variety of different things, and it wasn't meant to be taken completely seriously. And I actually think that this album is surprisingly good for what it is. This might surprise some people, but I'm actually going to give this one an A. This album would also feature the addition of Roger Powell and John Wilcox, who are both classic members of Utopia, so the only person missing on this album is Kazem Sultan, who would come in on the next one. And as far as the music goes on here, I think the songs are incredibly fun, catchy, groovy, and have plenty of surprising moments that make for a very fun and enjoyable listen. We have 8 originals and 2 covers, one being a Rick Derringer song titled Time Warp, and the other is an Alexander Courage song called Star Trek. Time Warp has got to be my favorite song on here. I love what's going on with the time signature on this one. You have the main guitar and keyboard groove that's in 7, but the drums just keep playing a 4/4 beat over it, which makes it carry over the bar line and then eventually line up again after the second time through. Just such a cool and groovy effect. And throughout this album, I honestly would say I don't dislike any of the tracks on here. I think the melodies are super catchy. I love the keyboard and synth sounds that they use. There's plenty of interesting musical moments happening all over between time signatures and rhythmic stuff, as well as colorful and unexpected chord movements. Whenever I listen to this one, I have always thought that it would be a great album to put on when you're playing video games, especially if you're playing like really classic early 90s video games. I think just the production, the synth sounds, everything about just the overall aesthetic of this album lends itself really nicely to vintage video games. So anybody who's listening to this who is a gamer, I would recommend putting this on. I think you will be pleasantly surprised. So even though this album was meant to be more of a comical sort of thing, I still think that they produced some incredibly catchy and fun music, and I actually find myself going back and listening to this album a lot. I think it's a very easy and enjoyable listen, and it functions really nice if you just need some feel-good, just colorful background music. And yeah, I just think it's a great album. So this one gets an A. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 1977 titled Raw, and I will give this one an S. Another amazing album, and this is my third favorite Utopia album. I think it's a great follow-up to Todd Rundgren's Utopia, and it would be the first album to feature that classic Utopia lineup with Todd Rundgren, Kazem Sultan, Roger Powell, and John Wilcox. We have 7 tracks on here consisting of different combinations of writers for each song, and I think the album does a really great job of continuing off of the sound that they built from their first album, but also having some songs that are on the shorter side, with only one really long song on here that's over 18 minutes in length, and then a couple that cross the 7-minute mark, and then the remaining 3 are all under 5 minutes in length. It opens up nicely with Overture, Mountaintop, and Sunrise, Communion with the Sun. A very epic and progressive track with a nice build to it and a great way to open up the album, and it segues into track 2 just so beautifully with Magic Dragon Theater. This is my second favorite track on this album, and one that would also probably make my top 10 favorite Utopia song list. I absolutely love the piano and vocal parts, doing some modal interchange, alternating between the minor scale and the Phrygian mode, which is a very colorful sound, and just a song that has all sorts of interesting chord changes and vocal melodies going in all sorts of different directions. And it also has some very cool single note background keyboard lines and sequences throughout the track. Then we go into song 3, which is Jealousy, and this is probably my least favorite song on here. I wouldn't say it's a bad song, but I think in comparison to the remainder of the album, this is probably the song that does the least for me. But like I said, still not a bad song. But after that, we have by far my favorite track on here, an absolutely beautiful ballad titled Eternal Love. Very pretty piano parts and an incredible vocal melody. I really love the reverse vocal parts halfway through the song. Very nice touch and just an amazing song, and another one that would definitely make my list of top 10 favorite Utopia songs. After that, side 1 concludes with Sunburst Finish, which is a really rocking track with some tasty guitar riffs and drum grooves. It's got a great trading section between Todd and Roger, which I always love to hear, and then it veers into some different grooves and feel changes, similar to the more progressive tracks from the first Utopia album, and I think it wraps up side 1 beautifully. Then side 2 consists of 2 tracks, starting out with Hiroshima, a really cool tune with great writing between the guitar and keyboards, a very powerful vocal melody, and this song has a really great intensity to it and opens up side 2 very nicely with this dark and ominous sort of mood. And then that sets up the final track, an 18.5-minute song titled Singring and the Glass Guitar. And this is another big prog blowout track. Very good closer, similar to how they closed the first album with the Icon. I don't think that anything can really top the Icon, but this is certainly a very fun and adventurous track as well, with all sorts of cool feel changes, guitar and keyboard riffs, and tasteful vocal melodies. And while I wouldn't say that I think this album reaches the highs that the first album did, I still think it's a great follow-up with a really great selection of songs that build off of the sound from album 1, and it also has a couple of tracks, like I said, that would make my top 10 favorite Utopia songs, with Eternal Love and Magic Dragon Theater. So a great second album. This one gets an S. Alright, now we have their third studio album from 1977 titled Oops, Wrong Planet, and I will also give this one an S. Amazing album, and a great release to set up this new trajectory for the Utopia sound. It still has some stylistic similarities to the albums that preceded it, but it also veers off into more of a pop rock and art rock direction, and I think it complements the more progressive first 2 albums really nicely and sets up a great framework for their future albums to continue to build off of. We have 12 tracks on here, which all range somewhere between 3 and 4 minutes in length, so no longer extended tracks like we had on the previous albums. And I think the variety from track to track is very smooth. The collaborative writing was done very tastefully, and the alternating of each member on vocals provides a great change in flavor from track to track. And while a lot of these songs are more in that pop rock sort of style, they still contain all of those Utopia and Todd Rundgren-esque elements that make them really unique and engaging and not cliche in the slightest. We have the really interesting chord progressions and colorful use of harmony and melody, interesting riffs and feel changes within songs, really catchy grooves and great writing between the guitars and keyboards. A couple of favorites of mine on here are Love Is the Answer. Obviously, that was a big hit to come out of this album and one of Utopia's most classic songs. And a couple of others that I love are My Angel, Windows, and Trapped. I think Trapped is a really strong opener, very fun, high energy, and engaging song. And I think that Windows is the unsung hero of this album. Such an interesting song with chord movements that go all over the place in all sorts of interesting and colorful directions, and the vocal melodies are so tasteful. This is probably my favorite Roger Powell song of the entire Utopia Utopia discography. And throughout this album, I think we're getting such strong songwriting contributions from each member. It's just a very solid album with everybody carrying their weight and contributing both compositionally and vocally in a very effective manner. And a great album to set the stage for this new era of Utopia that will be more centered around more trimmed down and pop-oriented songs, but still containing all of those unique elements that are a part of that classic Utopia sound. So another amazing album. This one gets an S. Alright, next we have their fourth studio album from 1979 titled Adventures in Utopia, and this one will get an easy S. I absolutely love this album, and this is my second favorite Utopia album. I think up to this point in their discography, they've really been on a roll. We have 10 tracks on here, and this one is in a similar vein to the previous album, stylistically with the pop rock and disco elements, but I think this one is unique in the fact that it also does a great job of incorporating a little bit more of the progressive and art rock elements as well, and to me this one has always been the perfect middle ground between the more progressive first two albums and then the poppier albums that would follow it. And side one is a great example of those stylistic combinations. We have 3 amazing tracks that are more on the pop rock side with The Road to Utopia, You Make Me Crazy, and Set Me Free. The Road to Utopia is the perfect opener with a little bit of a deceiving intro that has some more psychedelic rock elements to it. I've always loved the way that this song comes in. It has always reminded me of the opening track from The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and then it veers into a solid pop rock track that brings the album in really nicely. Set Me Free is a Utopia classic and ended up being their only song to be a top 40 single for them in the United States, and it's an incredible song. Then for the other 2 tracks on side 1, we have Second Nature, which is more in that art rock realm with some very exotic and adventurous chord movements that veer in and out of all sorts of colorful territories. The perfect track to contrast the opening 2 more poppy songs with The Road to Utopia and You Make Me Crazy. And then side 1 concludes with Caravan, which is a 7-minute track taking on some more progressive elements. I love the extended soloing between Todd and Roger at the end of this song. I always love whenever they do that, and I think side 1 of this album is pretty much spotless, and I love everything that they did on here stylistically. Side 2 then continues off of the vibes that they had established, with a couple of surprises thrown in here and there. I think side 1 is the high point of this album. I don't dislike any of the tracks on side 2, but all of my favorite songs from this album are on side 1. For me, on side 2, the final 2 tracks are really the highlight, with Love Alone and Rock Love. Love Alone is such a nice surprise with Chasm on lead vocals and the remaining 3 doing harmonies underneath him. Definitely getting some of those Beach Boys harmonies going on, which is very nice. And I've always felt like this song serves as like a precursor to Todd's a cappella album from 1985 in some ways, and the perfect second to last track on the album, setting up the groovy and disco-esque Rock Love very nicely, and that is an incredible closer to an amazing album. So all in all, I think this album has so much good stuff going on, a couple of classic Utopia pop tracks mixed with some progressive elements, some art rock elements, and then surprising us with the 4-part vocal harmony track. And although I do think side 1 is the stronger half, I don't dislike any of the songs on this album, and this one pretty regularly falls into my number 2 favorite Utopia album. So great album. This one gets an easy S. Alright, next we have their 5th studio album from 1980 titled Deface the Music, and I will give this one an A. Very solid album and very different from everything else that we've heard up to this point. The idea behind this album was to write songs that were influenced by the Beatles, and they definitely achieved that. These songs have so many Beatles flavors all throughout them, but also have little Utopia moments as well, and really sound like the perfect fusion of the 2 sounds. Each song has between 1 and 3 Beatles songs that they were inspired by, and I don't think you can beat the opening track, I Just Want to Touch You. To me, this song is the perfect hybrid of the Beatles and Utopia sound. The opening vocal and chord part sounds exactly like something from early Beatles, and then the bridge and the second half of the main section has some chord movements that definitely capture that Utopia sound. And it's fun to listen to these tracks and see if you can tell which Beatles songs they were inspired by, because some of them are pretty obvious. And after I Just Want to Touch You, my other 3 favorites on here are Alone, That's Not Right, and Everybody Else Is Wrong. The only thing I would say about this album for me personally, and this isn't even necessarily a critique, but because of the stylistic direction they went in on this one, I don't find myself going back and listening to this album as much as their other works, and this is the one that I need to be in a specific mood to listen to, but when I'm in the right mood for it, this is a very fun and enjoyable album, and I think they did an incredible job of capturing that Beatles sound and really demonstrating their ability to write songs that are almost indistinguishable from the artists that they're trying to mimic. So a solid album and a nice little change of pace from everything else that we've heard up to this point. So this one gets an A. Okay, next we have their 6th studio album from 1982 titled Swing to the Right, and I will give this one a B. Pretty good album, getting back into the stylistic territories that we heard on Oops, Wrong Planet and Adventures in Utopia, but I do think that this one has a couple of more skip-over tracks than those other two albums. Lyrically, this one is much more politically driven than any of the previous releases, and it also comments on religious themes. We have 10 tracks on here like we do with so many of their albums, and it has 9 originals and 1 cover, and to me, the opening song is by far the high point of the album, which is the title track, Swing to the Right. One of my all-time favorite opening songs of any Utopia album. I think it brings things in so nicely. It has a really great intensity to it. Instrumentally, it has some very cool parts going on, and also vocally, some very catchy and tasteful melodies. Then it continues with Liz Estrada, which is a great follow-up track, and then that is followed by The Up, which is a commentary on the news and how it fuels anxiety and division, and trying to be above that and overcome that. A great song with lyrical content that I think is more prevalent now than ever before. Then we go into Junk Rock, which has some very interesting synth sounds going on, and to me this is the first song where we really hear that sound shift that had started happening with groups in the 80s. Some bizarre sounding synth parts within the whole tone scale that create this really fascinating dissonance. I think the first 3 songs on here are probably the high point of the album for me, and we also hear more of that 80s sound creeping in on For the Love of Money, which was the one cover song on here, and one of a couple of songs that I'm not crazy about. The others that I don't really care for are Shinola, Fahrenheit 451, and One World. I love the message behind One World, but I've always found that song to be kind of corny and cliche sounding. For the second half of the album, the 2 high points for me are Last Dollar on Earth and Only Human. Only Human would be my second favorite song on here after the title track. Such interesting and colorful chord movements in the piano, beautiful vocal melodies, and beautiful lyrics doing a commentary on the human condition. So lyrically, I think what they are doing throughout this album is really great, and it is clearly the deepest stuff that they have written about up to this point. But from a musical perspective, I do think that this album does have a few dips here and there, and with the exceptions of Swing to the Right and Only Human, I wouldn't say any of the other tracks on here really reached the highs that Oops, Wrong Planet or Adventures in Utopia had hit. So I would say it's an okay album, but a slight downgrade from the albums that preceded it, so I will give this one a B. All right, now we have their 7th studio album from 1982 titled Utopia, their second self-titled album, and I will give this one an A. I think this album is actually surprisingly good. Initially, when I first heard it, I didn't think much of it for some reason, but after listening to it more, it really grew on me, and I think it has some really exceptional Utopia songs. We have 10 tracks, 2 of which had compositional contributions from bassist Doug Howard, who had stepped in when Chasm Sultan left to focus on his solo career, even though he did perform on this record. And for me, I have absolutely no problem with any of the songs on side 1. I think side 1 is almost flawless. I think it has a great momentum to it. Each track is interesting and tasteful in its own regard, and all of my favorite songs on here, with the exception of one, all happen on side 1. Libertine is an awesome and catchy opening track. Bad Little Actress contrasts it nicely and gives us a song with some more colorful and adventurous chord changes and vocal melodies. Feet Don't Fail Me Now is a nice upbeat and dancey sort of track, and one of 2 songs where Doug Howard had a co-writing credit on it. And I think you can hear the outside influence on this song a bit, but I think it still fits the Utopia aesthetic of the 80s very nicely. And then Neck on Up is another another catchy pop track. And then side 1 concludes with the awesome bluesy track Say Yeah, which has some seriously awesome and catchy vocal harmonies and a really solid groove to it. So for side 1, I think every track is great and they contrast each other nicely and creates a great momentum. And then we have side 2, which I still do enjoy, but I think that the momentum does die down a little bit, and we have a couple of tracks here and there that I think are pretty good, and 2 tracks that I just don't really care for, with A Hammer in My Heart and Burn 3 Times. Stylistically and compositionally, I do find these songs pretty underwhelming, and ultimately they are the reason why I put this in A tier as opposed to S tier. However, side 2 does have my favorite track from the album, I'm Looking at You But I'm Talking to Myself. Absolutely beautiful down-tempo track, and the second song to feature a co-writing credit from Doug Howard. This song to me has always sounded like something that could have been on an 80s Todd Rundgren album, and anytime there's a Utopia song that sounds like that, I never complain about it. And that would be the high point of side 2 for me. And then I also really like the closer, There Goes My Inspiration. I think it's a really pretty song and it wraps up the album very nicely. But other than that one track from side 2, all of my other favorites on here all happen on side 1. For side 1, my 3 favorites are Libertine, Bad Little Actress, and Say Yeah. So a very good album, and I would say it's an upgrade from Swing to the Right, and it has an incredible first side and a couple of solid tracks on side 2 as well. So this one will get an A. All right, now we have their 8th studio album from 1984 titled Oblivion, and unfortunately, I'm going to give this one a C. I've never been a big fan of this album, and this would definitely be my least favorite Utopia release. It still has a few tracks here and there that I do enjoy, but as an album, I do find it pretty weak, and of all of the Utopia albums, this one definitely has the most skip-over tracks for me. I'm also not a huge fan of the production choices they made. To me, this is by far the most cheesy 80s sounding album with more electronic drums and the choices of synths and keyboards, and it's not totally surprising to hear that on an album that was released in 1984, because that sort of sound and production style definitely became much more prevalent as we approached the mid-80s. We have 10 songs on here, and there's really only 4 songs that I enjoy, with the opening track, Itch in My Brain, as well as If I Didn't Try, Maybe I Could Change, and I Will Wait. If I Didn't Try is easily the standout track on here for me, and I think that song is really beautiful. But other than that, I don't find the remaining tracks of this album to be particularly interesting, and I don't think that this album reaches the highs that any of the previous Utopia releases had reached. So luckily, this wasn't their final album that they went out on, and they still have one more release to redeem themselves. But in my opinion, this is not a great release, and this would go down as my least favorite Utopia album. So this one gets a C. All right, now we have their 9th and final studio album from 1985 titled POV, and I will give this one a B. This has always been an interesting album for me because I do think it is good, and there's only really one song on here that I dislike, but I also don't think that it has as many highs as the albums that are in A and S tier. It does have a couple of songs that I do think are pretty exceptional, like Stand for Something, Secret Society, Mated, and More Light. And with the exception of Mystified, I don't dislike any of the other songs on here, but I wouldn't say that any of them would be regarded as any of my favorite Utopia songs. And I actually had debated putting this one in A tier, but it didn't seem right because I don't think it holds up with those albums. But I will say that I do like it a little bit more than Swing to the Right, which is also in B tier. And I do think it is a solid upgrade from Oblivion. And production-wise, I think they did a better job on this album than they had done on Oblivion. So not my least favorite album of theirs, and not the worst thing that they could have went out on. A couple of things that I really enjoy about this album is Todd Rundgren has some seriously awesome guitar solos throughout this on tracks like Style, Secret Society, Mystified, and More Light. I love the interplay between Todd and Roger on the tracks where they trade back and forth. And like I said, there are around 4 tracks on here that I would consider great and classic Utopia songs, but in the grand scheme of comparing it to their other albums, it did seem fitting to put it in B tier. So not the worst album that they could have went out on, but not one of their best, somewhere in between for me. So this one will get a B. All right, so that is it. Those are my takes for their 9 studio albums and the 1 unreleased Disco Jets album. Like I said at the beginning, I needed to spend a little more time with some of these albums to really solidify my thoughts, but after a few more listens, this is what I came up with, and I feel pretty good about it. So that is it for today. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear where you agree and disagree with my rankings, and I would love to hear where you would rank these 10 albums on your list. So please let me know, and feel free to check out some of my other tier lists linked in the description and the comments and see if there is anything else that you might like. Like I said at the beginning, I also did Todd Rundgren's studio albums, so if you haven't heard that one yet, be sure to check that one out and see if there is anything else that you might be interested in. All right, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was informative, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.